A lot of people talk about Lord of the Flies being about the darkness within humanity. There's an extent to which that's true, but I think more specifically it's about a group of characters who all happen to be male, and the way in which, in the absence of any adults, they play out ideas of their male role models, and quite problematic ideas of their male role models. Lord of the Flies is a story about a group of 11-year-old schoolboys who are in a plane flying away from a war-torn country, and they crash on an island and no adults survive. They have to figure out how to survive, but also how to govern themselves, how to set up their own mini-society. And over the course of the play, the group of boys splits into two. One who argues for shelters and for everybody having a turn to speak, and the other group who argues for hunting. And things go from bad to worse from there. I see very much the story operating in a way whereby the character of Jack applies a certain hierarchy and power dynamic that favours the rugby-playing popular strong boys and isolates those boys who are not as physically adept, who are more intellectual, who are more emotionally intelligent. That kind of split is really clear in terms of the way that certain masculine values are valued and how sort of traditional notions of feminine values are undervalued. We were interested in showing ways in which the hunting and killing of the pig, the blooding, and then the ultimate killing of Simon all stemmed from behaviours that the boys brought with them from the city or from their home life. So you hear Jack talking about the blooding that his uncle does when they go hunting on his uncle's farm, and we really expanded that moment on stage with Contessa actually playing out a mime of the blooding in the first act, so that when it's happening in Act 2, you know that she's taking this thing that she's learned from her uncle and extending it and creating her new kind of religion out of it. Same for the hunting, all of the kind of stamping and chanting that the boys do all comes out of their rugby chants that it gets set up in Act 1. We did a lot of work in Act 1 of exploring different rugby chants and how we could take something that felt like you would see it at a boys' school at a rugby match, and how would they take that into Act 2 and use that particular language of aggression and apply it to the hunting of the pig, and then how would they take that and evolve it again in the third act, when Jack really starts to create his own new society of sorts built around violence. I was interested in doing a gender-blind cast for this production of Lord of the Flies, largely to highlight the way in which the characters, who are still 11-year-old boys in this production, are performing ideas of gender. So I was interested in having adult actors not only playing these children, but adult actors playing children who are performing ideas of masculinity, really. And so I was interested in creating an ensemble of actors that really represented and reflected our society, such that I hope for audiences who see this production, there is an antidote to the kind of tragedy and horror of this story through seeing this group of people come together to work with one another to deliver this story to the audience. I was interested in putting together a group of actors representative of that generation that cares very much about equality, is very attuned to the intersections of identities and how power traditionally has been divvied up in a way which privileges certain people over others. One of the most specific casting choices was to cast two women as the two alpha males in the play, Ralph and Jack. These two characters represent masculine archetypes in our society, and I wanted to foreground the way in which even our masculine archetypes are people who are performing ideas of gender, and also to kind of break this idea that very physically strong and physically able characters, which we're used to seeing men play on stage, I'm interested in seeing those women play those roles. Two things happen when you cast women in those roles. One, you have the performance of gender highlighted for you, but also you start to forget the gender of both the character and the actor the further you fall into the production, and you start to understand the psychology of the human being and why that human being is playing out that role. So those two things really fascinated me in this piece, and I think they start to unpack the story in a really interesting way. I'm very keen for audiences to find their own interpretation of what the boy appearing at the end means. But the one thing that I will say is that the audience has been asked for an hour and 50 minutes to pretend that these 11 performers are playing 11-year-old cisgendered white boys. And after an hour and 50 of watching them do so, you really forget that that's what they've been doing in a great way. You've become so absorbed within the story. And the intention of the final moment, aside from generating multiple meanings for an audience, is to assert back on stage the body that has been absent for the past hour and 50 minutes, the body you've been asked to imagine, and then to juxtapose that image of the boy with this particular ensemble and to see those two in juxtaposition with one another. The major concept for the piece was this gender-blind ensemble playing these kids, adults playing these kids. And so there's a level of abstraction built within that concept. And so we wanted a design that was going to match that conceptual gesture by saying to an audience, we're not offering you literal actors to play these characters, we're also not offering you a literal space to generate the world of this play. So there's going to be no sand, there's going to be no trees and ocean. You're going to have to imagine that all yourselves. Connected to that was this idea that the boys are engaged in an act of play in the first half hour of the show, playing rugby, but also playing adults in the absence of adults, playing leader, so to speak. And so innate within the show is this sense of play in the first half hour, and so we wanted the design to be playful in that sense too. And that's all about imaginative play for the audience as much as it is about for the characters. We also felt that this particular design aesthetic would allow us to generate a kind of sense of descent into anarchy that matched the boys' descent into anarchy. And so we felt that hitting moments in Act 2, where the story is meeting a certain climax with regards to the boys' behavioural decay, we would have moments, for example, of a performer hacking up the floor with an axe. And so even though the sort of abstract language is maintained throughout the production, it always is intended to match the way in which these boys are spiralling out of control. The kinetic lights for the show are a central part actually of the set design, which was done by Elizabeth Gadsby, and then Elizabeth and I collaborated with our lighting designer, Alex Bellage, to incorporate them into the lighting design of the show and to create all of the different shapes that you see throughout the production. We were trying to grow this island out of an empty theatre space, and it felt like the lights were one of the most immersive ways we could do that, to kind of completely change the mood and tone and environment of that space. There are 36 of them. They run off 72 motors. So it was a very complex process trying to put it all together, but hugely rewarding, not only in terms of the way that it evokes landscape, but the way that it also starts to tip the production into a more surreal nightmarescape. We thought conceptually about this work that we would start in an open, empty theatre where nearly everything would have to be generated by the audience's imagination. And then in Act 2, when the lights come in, we would be in a more immersive environmental space. And then in Act 3, the lights would shift and become even more abstract and take you by the end into that nightmarescape as Ralph is being hunted. And they work very effectively. We've talked at length in the rehearsal room about the different ways in which this story has contemporary resonances, and a lot of what we talked about was what William Golding was responding to when he was writing the piece. He was writing in response to World War II, which was a terrible atrocity that grew out of the growth of right-wing extremist fascist ideologies across the 1930s in Europe. And it's interesting now, 80, 90 years later, to see similar political trends emerging throughout the world. And so even though we're living in an age where we've made great progress with regards to trans rights, the Me Too movement and feminism, Black Lives Matters, marriage equality, representation and access for people living with disability, we're also living in a time where certain pockets of society are pushing back against those gains. And Lord of the Flies feels like a story that explores that fault line between a group of people in society who are seeking egalitarianism and those who wish to hang on to power and have more power than others and cling on to that privilege.